All right, fabulous. So it's been great actually to hear Dion already mention a couple of the participants and speakers who are up here with me this morning as some of the active initiatives in the region. It's very interesting to see that particularly when it comes to transparency-focused initiatives in high-risk sectors, there's actually a lot that is going on in the region. I mean, obviously also globally, but particularly in the Southern African region as well. And so we also have, I think, one of the initiatives that is operating globally, but actually HQ'd here in the region and in the Seychelles. And so we're very interesting to hear a little bit from our participants this morning about. This has all been going on for a couple of years now. What are the lessons learned? What is sort of like the way forward? What are you looking towards in terms of stakeholder engagement? Who's maybe missing? Where are some of the difficulties? But also in terms of being able to really demonstrate impact. So we'll kick it off also to make up a little bit of time with Sven. I would like to introduce Sven from the Fisheries Fisheries Transparency Initiative. He's the executive director based in the Seychelles, as I just mentioned. FITI is a global multi-stakeholder partnership which strengthens transparency and collective action for more sustainable management of marine fisheries. He has 20 years of professional experience focusing on practical and sustainable solutions for good governance, multi-stakeholder partnerships, corporate social responsibility, risk management, and business integrity. So the perfect person to speak to for our forum. So very much looking forward to hearing a little bit about how the Fisheries Transparency Initiative was set up, who you're working with, and the aims. And I think we have actually video to introduce the Fisheries Transparency Initiative before I'm handing over to Sven. Can we play that, please? Thank you.
Coast program in Malawi. First and foremost, when it was first introduced, stakeholders were a bit hesitant. For us to secure high buy-in, it wasn't easy because it was thought to be witch hunting. But then we emphasized and assured stakeholders that it's not about witch hunting, it's not about finger pointing, it's not about blame game, it is about good practice. And for those institutions that are willing and ready to bring forth information on infrastructure programs, it is also an opportunity for them to exonerate themselves from mere propaganda, slander, fabrications, and negativity. Impact, yes, now we are able to secure or to see constructive media coverage, objective media coverage of infrastructure programs. We are also able to see institutions voluntarily coming forth with information. The gathering here, members, our fellow participants might wish to know also that the COAST program has been recognized to form part of a technical working group that will lead into Malawi being readmitted into the OGP. And we are going to reignite, the state president is going to reignite and relaunch the OGP next week actually, thanks to the COAST program. Having said that, finally, I need to mention also that the current president or the current political administration has created what they're calling Presidential Delivery Unit, whereby projects are tracked, institutions and ministries and departments are tasked to explain project expenditure, project delays, and project problems and challenges. And this Presidential Delivery Unit has factored in COAST as one of the key institutions to work with. So if that is not impact, if that is not positive, I don't know what will be positive anyway. Thank you.
Brilliant. Maybe just before I hand over to Ian, just to kind of wrap that up, without going into too much detail around sort of the actual methodology and reporting, but I was just wondering if you could maybe reference, because I think it's always nice to have some concrete examples in terms of benefit, of money that is being saved, of having sort of tangible outcomes of the initiatives, of seeing as you do a lot of assessment and reporting as part of cost throughout these large infrastructure projects, if you have any examples of where your reporting has sort of like, maybe stopped a certain project or has really sort of had that clear impact.
Excellent question, Scarlet. I may not have the actual figures at my fingertips, but I can mention 2 or 3 key issues. The first and foremost was that over the years, because of the cost findings, which come out of an assurance program or methodology, as you are calling it, government has been able to stop some road projects and actually request for them to be retendered. Members might also wish to learn that on the 12th of July last year, the President directed all ministries, departments, and agencies in Malawi to upload information on the portal that I mentioned. Before he made that directive, we had less than 40 contracts on the portal. If you go on the portal today, you should access not less than 300 live, ongoing, proposed, and completed projects. So you can see that is impact already. That said, there was a time in Malawi when government ministries were implementing projects in-house. But because of the cost program, we now see ministries and agencies outsourcing, because you can't be the same one. You conceive a project, you prepare the bills of quantities, you do the procurement, and then you implement and supervise in the same ministry. Because of cost, this now is history. Isn't that impact enough? Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Joe. And I'm sure we could find much more impact the longer we would continue the discussion, but maybe we can come back to that. Last but certainly not least, I think we're moving from fisheries to construction infrastructure over to extractives, another big high-risk industry. And so I'd like to welcome Ian Mwiinga. He is the National Coordinator for the Zambia EITI Secretariat, which is hosted by the Ministry of Mines and Minerals Development in Zambia. The Secretariat provides support, administrative implementation support for the EITI Council, which is also, as we've heard before, all of those initiatives are led through this multi-stakeholder approach, and the same goes for EITI as well. So the Extractive Transparency Initiative. He also served as a board member of the EITI International Secretariat, representing the Anglophone and Lusophone EITI implementing countries, so actually quite a few of the countries in the region. So I think he's the perfect person to talk about the impact of EITI, the way that you're approaching it and trying to address some of those core risks in the extractive sector. So happy to hand over to you to tell us a little bit more about that.
Thanks a lot, Scarlet, and good morning, everyone. Yeah, just to start off, for colleagues that might not be familiar with the EITI, it's a mouthful, extractive. And I suppose you just remove the F and put the E on the FITI. So the EITI works in jurisdictions that are rich in minerals, that are rich in gas, and rich in oil. But also some countries like Liberia, they also focus on forestry. And I'm happy also that we do have the Seychelles, which is also part of the EITI. They are countries that focus on fisheries. So essentially, the EITI looks at the extractive sector in a holistic way, if you like. But of course, I think what is interesting now about the EITI is the fact that we are not only looking at these commodities as they are. we are looking at these commodities in the way they will be applied now and in the future. And I think here what I'm talking about is the energy transition, the changing landscape in the commodities sector. And I think, Scarlet and colleagues, you may agree with me that, the commodity sector is one of the high-risk sectors because this is a revenue spinner. If you take a random check in most of the economies, globally even, you realize that the commodity sector is actually one of the major contributors to revenue. And I think we all know that any sector that is a revenue spinner is actually a high-risk sector. And this risk comes in several forms. One of which is, for example, as we heard before, issues around who bears the risk and who retains the value. And here I'm talking about issues, for example, we heard in Namibia that there was actually a fish rot gate. Is it a fish gate? Where money's revenue was paid to obscure persons. And here I'm talking about who are the beneficial owners of these assets. This morning I was listening to news about South Africa drilling some shale gas in the Karoo, and I was wondering, do you know the investors? I'm not talking about legal owners or shareholders, the bone and flesh, the humans behind those transactions. Also, I think bringing it home here, there is actually a lot of load shedding. And in most of our countries now, there's a rush to bring in this clean energy, to beat the load shedding, to also transition from fossil fuels. Billions of dollars are coming into our countries. Who is actually driving those revenues? There are issues around conflict of interest. In terms of, for example, if you look at the awarding of these rights, if it's licenses, contracts, what is the procedure of awarding these contracts? In cases where there are politicians involved, is there a process for people to declare interest? In cases where we have state-owned enterprises, I mentioned earlier that for most of our presidents now, they have a dilemma either to look west, have democracy and soft support. But if you want your voters to see roads, bridges built, you have to look east. But in that instance, then, how do we deal with instances where state participation and capital is actually intertwined? Issues around subsidiaries, state-owned enterprises. We have ESCOM here. What are the issues? Who are the contractors to ESCOM, for example? I can go on, but the point to bring here, Scarlet, is that the EITI actually looks at these risks and acknowledges that in the transitioning to clean and green energy, these risks are going to be amplified. And you realize that when you have a lot of revenue, the price of corruption, if you like the cost, it becomes affordable because there's excess revenues that people can dish around in form of bribes, in form of whatever incentives that they give. And so for the EITI to be able to open that obscure box, we try to disclose all these revenues, what companies are paying to the governments, the taxes and non-tax revenues, but also, most importantly, the fees that go to local authorities. In other jurisdictions, what we have noted is that mining communities receive huge sums of money in property rates and also business fees. Who actually follows those? And I think I've seen quite a lot of good work from civil society to actually track those revenues, how those revenues end up in the budget, or in fact, how the accountability is actually done through community beneficiation. Finally, just to leave it out from the context, Scarlet, is that The EITI now is increasingly, broadening its scope beyond just the extractive sector. You will realize that within the EITI, we have, your countries that are not even mining, Western countries. We have commodity traders. Commodity traders are the intermediaries between the producers and the manufacturers. We have seen recently new forms of agreements. For example, Tesla. Tesla has signed an agreement with, is it Indonesia? $1 billion agreement. We have seen countries going straight to these manufacturers, whether it's Hyundai, it's Mercedes-Benz. How do we actually ensure that the oversight institutions are actually positioned to be able to actually interface with these risks? I'll leave it at that for now, Scarlet. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And maybe just to follow up as a question to actually all of you, and we can kick it off with Ian. Following up also from the discussion in the first panel, I think what has come out quite strongly there was that something that is really missing in a lot of these initiatives and discussions is we're trying to provide impact incentives, but then the accountability piece. What happens when stakeholders, governments, private sector do not live up to what it is that they're officially committed to? So I think it would be very interesting because these transparency initiatives are all sort of have government commitment, but also in certain instances, private sector commitment and support from other stakeholders to just hear what are those accountability mechanisms, what has that experience been like, and sort of how are you looking to the future in terms of maybe strengthening that and balancing the sort of accountability also with incentives.
That's a hard one, to be honest with you, because, for example, if you look at the revenue tracking mechanisms, most jurisdictions do not have earmarked revenues. They say money is fungible. The revenues that come in from whatever sector goes in one pot and it loses color. So the accountability side is very, very critical. And I think the role of civil society should not be underplayed. Because whatever information, and as mentioned by colleagues, is that the struggle has been to utilize what is disclosed. You can imagine a 200-300-page EITI report with blue and white colors, numbers. That's really boring. It's not fun. So really, I think the challenge is up to us, the stakeholders, to find a way how this information can be socialized. It can be made more fun to the youths, the students, and so many other stakeholders. Because otherwise, even in other jurisdictions where people are pushing for access to information bills, I always wonder to say, but have you seen the information that is already disclosed? There's a demand to disclose contracts. What do you do with a contract if you don't have the technical capacity to actually read it? I think sometimes more is probably not good. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Super. Sven, do you want to pick up on that as well?
Yeah, that probably would go, next 2 hours to really delve into this. But so on the accountability side, if a government makes a commitment, even if it is a voluntary standard, such as EITI, cost or FITI, I think all of the initiatives have validations, they review, which could mean that if a government doesn't perform properly, they get a warning, they get a delisting, which is something that governments are afraid of. There's no financial aspect with it, but there's a reputational aspect with it. But the key aspect that Ian started with that we are looking into at the moment as well is how do we make sure that people actually understand what is happening there. And we started with the FITI. We looked at these EITI reports and like 500 pages, hundreds of pages that look like Excel sheets, and you just don't get it. And you cannot expect even a civil society organization to go in and find certain things. So this the need to present the data in an understandable way is now one of the key pillars that we are working on the FITI. However, I also have to say that is matched with a really unhealthy desire from the public, including civil society, for simple stuff, you know? The TikTok answer that leaves you 30 seconds and I got it. And that's just not how it works. Yeah. You know, oil, gas, and mining, fisheries it's complex stuff. And if you want to conserve fish, then you can't catch enough fish. Well, what are you going to do with the economy? Because you still need to process it. So you have more fish and you have less jobs. That is a debate that, you know, you cannot do in, oh, I'm going to spend 5 minutes thinking about it, no matter how great, you know, videos we have and, you know, colorful brochures. So that the need to sit down and actually go into the topic from civil society, from business, but also, honestly, from some of the intergovernmental organizations, is something that I see as a key aspect. I think it is an unfortunate trend that we need to keep in mind that, you know, there is not this single, simple, you know, quick answer to just get things done and then we're all happy again.
I think that is probably true for most of our work here in the room. Making it simple and understandable is a challenge, but important to get the message out with containing the substance in it. Joe, I don't know if you would like to add on that.
Yes, thank you, Scarlet. Accountability mechanisms. The question is, what happens if duty bearers, institutions don't live up to our expectations, or in short, if they don't comply? Outside the Coast Malawi example is that we are not working in a vacuum. We are actually pushing this agenda, this program within the law, and which law, one might ask? The Access to Information Law, which is well enacted in my country, but also the PPDA law. The PPDA is the Public Procurement and Disposal of Assets Law. In fact, when the president made this directive on the 12th of July last year for MDAs or institutions to upload information, he actually cited the law. Now, each law, at least the two that I've cited, has got punitive measures for non-compliance. So if the question is posed, what if duty bearers don't play ball? The law should take its own course. And then it is not incumbent upon our program to be both the prosecutor and the judge. We now pass it on to relevant governance institutions and government bodies to take over at least our part we have done to advocate for transparency. Thank you.
Thank you. And as far as I know, not in Malawi, but in some of the other coast countries in the region, they have actually been closed down because of non-compliance of government. So I do think, even though it's probably not the most ideal way, it is that sort of red line that is possible to do. I think maybe we can, before we open it up for questions to all of the participants, seeing as we all have you here on stage, and there seems to be sort of a common red thread in terms of methodology and approach, I think it would be very interesting to hear if you think, is there any way, we talk about collective action and collaboration amongst the stakeholders, but what about these initiatives? You are all trying to strive for something similar, yes, in your individual sectors, but maybe just opening the question of, there's a lot of activity in the region with these different initiatives. Is there a way for you to collaborate and to kind of strengthen more the overall transparency when it comes to risky sectors? And I know, just as an example, and I'm sure Ian can talk about it, but the opening extractives as an example where open contracting partnership and EITI have come together to collaborate on beneficial ownership. And as far as I know, which is one of the reasons why it's a favorite example, is because this is actually supported and financed by the private sector, by the BHB Foundation. And I remember speaking to them when they set it up and asked them, why are you investing millions into this project? And they said that the amount of money they have to spend on due diligence is so outrageous that they were actually saying, we want to be proactive. We're investing in this, in supporting these initiatives to develop beneficial ownership registries, and that will actually reduce our costs. So I thought it was a really interesting example of sort of private sector stepping in. But I don't know if you want to talk about that experience a little bit, and then we'll bring it to everyone in terms of collaboration.
Absolutely. I think that's a classic example. I think that really underlines the need for convergency of these various standards. I was looking at the video that Sven shared. Their standard is this color. This is the EITI standard. So you can see that even in terms of the design and the intention, all these standards are actually speaking to one thing. In terms of the opening extractive program, I think there's a lot of value that we have realized implementing this program. It is actually implemented in 11 countries at the moment, and what we have realized along the way is that most of the struggles that we thought were actually barriers to implementing beneficial ownership transparency was in fact as a result of the institutional setup. The private sector were saying, look, all we hear from you is, can you provide us this information? You are not giving us the business case. And I think there are really critical lessons that we've had going through this process. But also at the same time, we've also realized our deficiencies. Because there's always this thinking that, as regulators, we know it all. We don't. And I think that admission is really, really critical so that you actually enhance cross-learning. And also, one last thing that we have also seen from implementing this program is the looping in of other regulators, such as the Financial Intelligence Center. Yesterday, again, on news here, I heard a conversation around grey listing of, I think, South Africa or another country. So these issues all converge to one thing. And I think that recognition for me is critical because it will save us time. It will bring resources and skills to bear which are not really present in sort of all around in all the sectors. So I think it's an absolute great step, and we look forward to even more collaboration. I know that there are reporting standards around ESTIMA, GRI, and the list goes on. Why not have convergency? Thank you.
Thank you. Sven, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, when the invitation came in for this panel, the major lesson learned was, looking at the title, is that we do not share enough lessons learned. I think that's also what Professor Russo said. The morning we have these, if we can say, great initiatives, but we are so focused on our sector, and sometimes we reach out to, okay, let's work with the OGP a little bit so we can anchor it. But at the end of the day, the standards are very similar. We all do multi-stakeholder, we all do transparency, we all do validations, et cetera, and we all struggle on the same level, and there is some sector-specific stuff. Mm-hmm. But and maybe organizations like the Basel Institute, could work on that a little bit more. I think there needs to be that convener. But what we are seeing right now as well, and that is maybe one of the way forwards, is it's not only we need to collaborate better, it's also the countries that host these initiatives need to do a better job of collaborating. Because I was looking at it yesterday. Ecuador is a member of the EITI, Ecuador is a member of the FITI, and Ecuador is a member of the COST. National multi-stakeholder groups is, if I may say that, a shitload of work to do, to keep them running. So you need a national secretariat. That means Ecuador is now, and they have, 3 national secretariats where people are sitting there organizing meetings, writing meeting minutes, looking at deadlines, etc. That can be consolidated in a national transparency office. So we also need to work on that because governments in their sector are already overwhelmed. If you look at the multitude of issues that the Ministry of Fisheries or Oceans is facing, from climate change to pollution to seawater rising, etc., it's too much. And if then we're coming and saying from a government point of view, you need to have you need to service this national multi-stakeholder group and this one, it's just too much. So I think we need to also work on that and come up together and basically say, look, country X, you're working with all 3. How about you bringing things together into one national transparency office that may even work with the OGP and just make it a bit more efficient instead of having too many people doing the same stuff, probably not as efficient as they could be.
Yeah, I think I would have to agree. Running these initiatives and working collaboratively through collective action takes a lot of time and effort and resources. So if there's any way to kind of find alignment, that would be beneficial. I don't know, Joe, if you have anything to add in terms of the opportunity to collaborate with others, transparency initiatives in Malawi or in the region as well.
Collaboration, Scarlet and members, is a huge key way to go. There is a reason, there should be a reason why a football team has 11 players, netball has 7, rugby, you might correct me, has 15. Why? There is power in numbers. And if and when we work in isolation, that's where we see and observe that our efforts appear not to be bearing that much fruit. But if we join hands and work together, there is power in numbers. When like-minded individuals and institutions speak in one voice, the world listens. Coast Malawi continues to work in collaboration with like-minded institutions, like Basel, like Ben Africa, like EITI, and so forth and so on. So indeed, probably by the end of this kind of gathering today or tomorrow, we may wish to agree or renew our commitment to working as a team as we push the governance agenda in Africa ahead. Thank you.
I think that is a beautiful sort of first closing moment for us to open up to any questions. I don't know if there's any questions here at the front.
Thank you so much, Christine. And my question gets into the weeds of the cost, FITI mostly, and of course, Ian, if you have any thoughts on this, it will be helpful. And it comes from years of supporting collective action work in Kenya and in Nigeria, of course with multiple stakeholders, and sometimes the feedback from the public sector is, well, we're doing all this hard work to ensure transparency, but the private sector's culture of corruption is so strong that it undermines all this hard work. And so you all need some kind of self-regulation within the private sector. And so that's taking us back to chambers and associations to say, you need to up your standards of business ethics and integrity and hold yourselves accountable because, it's the private sector that's sabotaging our collective action effort. Has this been something you've heard in cost? Saying, it's the private sector that's now offering us bribes. It's the private sector that's now saying, close this collective action working group that has so far been successful, but there are invested interests in the private sector that nobody's holding accountable. So have you had that feedback? Do you have some self-regulation mechanisms, within cost for the private sector actors? And then just second quick question, and this goes to what Ian has been talking about with regards to funding from the East and the impact of funding. I'll talk about that a little bit. And my question is, yes, there tends to be a pattern where it looks like funding from the East, for lack of a better word, could potentially be corrosive in terms of investment. But have you found that stronger accountability mechanisms in Malawi, for instance, has helped to manage the potential corrosive impact of funding from the East that often comes from authoritarian regimes and would come with conditions that undermine accountability systems and mechanisms in different countries? Look to Kenya, like the SGR rail and all the challenges with that.
Thank you. I don't know who would like to there were multiple questions in there. I know, Ian, that there are sort of standards that the multinational companies, extractive companies, have signed up. And I remember some of those discussions around when there's a big scandal and what the consequence is for those companies that are signed up. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that in terms of self-regulation and what that experience has been like, and then we'll hand over.
Actually, that's a very, very good question regarding the consequences of bad behavior, if you like. And I think in the EITI circles, we have an endless list of bad players, if you like. And I think it's common knowledge that some of the global commodity traders and mining companies have actually been taken to court, and they are paying a very high price. But I think in terms of really curing that, from the standard point of view, what we have seen, there's actually sort of a new way of how governments are actually interfacing with the Eastern investment. And I think for us, it's a very huge cause of worry. There is a fancy name which they call resource-backed loans, where we have seen sovereigns actually mortgaging their resources for immediate financing. I would not want to mention countries, but if you're following the news, just last week, one country signed, I think, $6 billion worth of resources. But the question one asks is that, how did you actually value that mineral to amount to $6 billion? What would that mineral be in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years? The price of nickel now is about $22,000 per ton. A few years back, it was around $11,000. The price of cobalt is around $52,000 per ton. And so the cyclical nature of the resources, the pricing, the risks, and everything makes it even more harder to actually make those valuations. However, the Eastern investment is not listed. It doesn't play by any rules. It's private investment. And therefore, I think the core for very robust and strong governance institution cannot be overemphasized. You may wish to know just quickly that the gestation period for most mining projects is beyond the electoral cycle of a sitting president, for example. If you look at exploration, it's about 8 years. That's almost 2 terms of a sitting president. Now, can you imagine a president who wants to win votes? Is he going to be patient to wait for that process to actually unfold? Certainly not. And that is why we are sounding the alarm well ahead of time to avoid the green resource curse. Missed the opportunity, the mess that we had in the other boom, and bring these risks to amplify and lose out completely through the race to the bottom. Ideally, countries now should have been bidding each other up. But now, even Zambia, Namibia, Botswana, Congo, we now all have copper, but we are bidding our investments down, which is sad. So Eastern investment is a source of worry. That would be what I'll say. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we head on, I just wanted to add onto Lola's question very quickly, also around the Opening Extractives project, where I think for some of the transparency initiatives, it can actually be difficult to really get the private sector actively involved because it is considered more of a government. You have the government commitment, so everyone's looking at government, and then even though you have the multi-stakeholder group, it can be quite difficult to then open up the conversation. But for Opening Extractives, there was a dual commitment, as I understood it, of the governments that are involved in the projects and internationally, globally. I think it was 5 or 6 of the biggest mining companies have made the commitment along with that of saying we are going to publish our beneficial ownership. It would be interesting to hear if they have. I mean, again, talking about follow-up and accountability here, but I thought that was an interesting model. I don't know, Joe, if you have maybe a very quick feedback on the question that was asked here in terms of private sector of having to develop your own standards in order to really be part of that conversation, as well as investment coming from the East and the experience in Malawi in the construction sector there.
Thank you so much, Laura, for your question. Feedback from private sector or private sector involvement is not as simple as it sounds. Coast Malawi Multistakeholder Group has got 13 members. These are institutions and individuals who have accepted to get involved in infrastructure transparency. The fact that for the past 15 years of Coast Malawi's existence, I am the only private sector representative on the board tells a story. Why? Private sector or business players are not ready and willing to stick their neck out. They don't want to bend their fingers. Not that Coast Malawi has not reached out to private sector. We've got a whole chamber in Malawi, which is, they tout themselves to be captains of the industry. But they are not willing to come forth to champion this agenda. Scarlet and Basel will agree with me. That's the very reason why I found myself on the mentorship program for Basel. Would want to tap from the wider membership on how we can rope in private sector in earnest. Because, as I said, private sector or business players, they are not too keen to get involved. I can quickly just cite an example. People have asked me, you are championing and promoting transparency. I say, yes. In construction, yes. What is your career? I tell them, I am a contractor. Then I am asked, are you crazy? So that alone should tell you that it is not a walkover or a straw in the open ground to champion transparency when you are coming from the private sector. But all is not lost. You may wish to know that now with the new political administration in Malawi, private sector is being engaged, and we can see light at the end of the tunnel. When we convene again, I'll have a report in the positive.
We look forward to that. I don't know, there's a question over here.
Sorry. I'm just moving this way because I have a question. I think it's directed at Sven. Just in terms of Namibia and the fish rot scandal there, and I'm not sure if everyone is aware of it, but there's many high-ranking officials and former ministers and so on that was involved in the illegal obtainment of quotas and so on. So I'm interested to know whether you have approached or the initiative has approached the Namibian government because, or whether they have approached you because they really should. So just if there's something happening there, thank you.
And again, that is a great example for lack of collaboration between the initiatives. We have reached out to the Namibian government, and it starts to get, there's much more traction from the business side in Namibia, because all that Namibia is currently known for is the fish rot scandal, and not of the fish and what they do. And I think they have a decent quota system with a certain national chair, etc. So they're doing some interesting things, but everything that everyone talks about Namibia is currently the fish rot. So we are starting to reach out. I think I am scheduled to go to Namibia in a few weeks to intensify this. But what we've heard is that, and I just learned this because we talked. Ian said, okay, you have to talk to this consultant because they're writing a study about EITI, and the study wrote about including fisheries in EITI, which doesn't make any sense from a national multi-stakeholder point of view. But if you're not aware of all the initiatives that are out there, then obviously, maybe the thinking goes, this is better than nothing. So again, this is something where we do need more collaboration to make sure that we are aware of what each other's direction and objective is. So hopefully in a few months' time, we can count Namibia as one of the countries that is a FITI country. We're working on it.
Great, fabulous. I think we have one question here at the back.
Okay.
Yes?
All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Sifi Sonkosi from the UN Global Compact. I just have a question for the Fisheries Transparency Initiative. Last year I was fortunate enough to be at the UN Oceans Conference, and like looking at the fact that most of the topics in the main panels, not sure about the side events, but most focus was on the just transition, climate change, women inclusion, and so forth, and not much about transparency in the industry. And to see that, it's my first time hearing about the Fisheries Transparency Initiative, and which is a great initiative, especially considering that during like the fact that in the just transition alone, we're going to have a lot of contracts within the industries. For example, South Africa is already heading towards zero emissions within that zero emissions transportation within that industry. So it has signed like hydrogen contracts there. So have you tried to contact like key role players within the industry to ensure that transparency is at the forefront? Because right now it's just been climate change as well as like just transition within that specific industry. So have you contacted key stakeholders? And also, how do you ensure that all governments are involved? And how do you bring the topic to the forefront? Because it's very important, considering that also Principle 8 and 9 of the Sustainable Oceans Principles focuses on data and transparency. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, great question. Looking at the time,
Yeah.
I'll try to make it very short, but there's also coffee breaks and lunch breaks later. Look, if you go to an ocean conference, you hear everything. And if you look at the ocean, and it's not the oceans, it's the ocean, to show it is connected. We need a collaborative approach for one ocean and not treating the Pacific separately from the Atlantic and otherwise. Fisheries was one part of one of the days, and if you look at the multitudes of issues in fisheries, and transparency is one side of it. What we're seeing at the moment, and I have to mention that, is an unhealthy trend on what transparency can be used for. And it looks like we're rolling a little bit back the idea of transparency as finding the smoking gun. And we're talking about investments from the East. I would say not all the ideas that are coming from the North and the West are equally brilliant. And we're seeing now this, I think we are at 2023, we're halfway through the SDGs. People are starting not to panic, but if you look at the SDG 14, which deals with the ocean, a lot of the targets have already been missed. So this topic of multi-stakeholder collaboration, go together, go far, etc., it takes time. I think a lot of donors, some of the countries are losing patience with that kind of approach. And we are seeing first indications that is now shifting again more to law and order, conviction, and this is what transparency is supposed to deliver. So this proactive transparency approach for participatory governance, etc., is challenged by more things like let's do uncovering, Panama Papers, whistleblowing. We need to get the big things out. I call it tabloid transparencies to make big headlines on these kind of things. And this is really a challenge that we see, but we are, we're working with the World Bank is on our board, the FAO is on our board, one of the biggest fishing companies or fishing processing companies is on our board, to make sure that people understand you need both. You need this transparency approach to find the smoking gun, the illegal fishing vessels out on the ocean. At the same time, you need to strengthen the multi-stakeholder collaboration to ensure that there is a benefit. And if I can add one sentence, there's been a study made that showed what is the factor while some of the fish stocks fail and some of the fish stocks are still at a very high level. And the one decisive factor is not law enforcement, it's not satellite monitoring. The one decisive factor is stakeholder involvement. That's the only thing that all of the good performing fish stocks have in common. So that makes the case, but it is currently being challenged by impatience from Western countries and Western donors.
Thank you. I think the call to stakeholder collaboration is the perfect way to end it. I'm really sorry. I know we could probably continue this conversation probably for the whole day with all the interesting approaches and potential that your initiatives bring. But I think in the interest of time and interest of having a coffee as well, we will wrap it up. But all of the panelists will be around, so please feel free to connect with them directly. And maybe just as a final thought from my side, in terms of takeaway, for me is the opportunity of collective action initiatives to come together in a collective action to convergence for more impact. So I think as a sort of takeaway and concrete potential next step, which we're really looking forward to hopefully supporting or seeing in future. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for all of your questions. So join me in thanking the panelists, and we'll be heading into break in a second. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.